I'm Tucker, and you are in Last Moments. Join me as we uncover why these Karens die because of stupidity. From a woman screaming at cafe workers over a half-filled coffee to a movie theater argument over a reserved seat, ending with a deadly fall onto a steel handrail. It was July 19, 2018, in Tampa, Florida. A humid afternoon with heat shimmering off the pavement of a strip mall parking lot. The lunchtime rush was steady at a small cafe known for its drive-through coffee line that often wrapped around the building. Most customers waited patiently in the slow crawl of cars, but one driver stood out that day. 44-year-old Darlene Cooper, a part-time insurance clerk who came by a few times a week. Co-workers later said Darlene had a habit of recording minor confrontations on her phone, whether it was with store clerks, delivery drivers, or neighbors. That afternoon, she ordered a large hot coffee and a muffin from the cafe. When the drink was handed to her through the window, she lifted the cup, looked at the lid, and complained that it wasn't filled all the way. The worker apologized and offered to make a new one, but Darlene began raising her voice, drawing attention from other cars in line. Witnesses in nearby cars said she began shouting that she was being cheated out of her money. The cashier tried again to hand her a new cup, but Darlene tossed the one she'd been given through the open window. The coffee splashed across the counter and hit a young worker's arm. Security footage later showed staff stepping back in shock as Darlene drove forward a few feet, threw her SUV into park, and got out. She walked quickly toward the window, still holding her phone up in front of her. The video later recovered from that phone showed her yelling about poor service, demanding the worker's name, and pacing near the concrete post that marked the edge of the drive-through lane. The manager inside told her to leave, or he would call the police. Instead, she turned sharply and walked back toward her vehicle, muttering that she had evidence. Customers in line behind her recalled that she was still recording while pulling open the driver door. The air outside was thick, over 90 degrees, and the sound of idling engines mixed with her shouting. She set her phone on the dashboard mount, half inside the car, half standing outside. The door was still wide open. According to investigators who later reviewed the footage, what happened next lasted less than 5 seconds. Darlene swung her leg inside, trying to slam the door shut with her left hand while keeping her phone balanced on the dashboard mount. The engine was still running, and as she moved to sit back down, her foot pressed the accelerator instead of the brake. The SUV jerked forward with a short screech of tires. The open door hit the concrete post beside her parking space. The metal folded backward, trapping her between the door's inner edge and the car frame. The force crushed her upper chest against the steering column. The phone recording captured a burst of noise, then went still. A man 2 cars behind witnessed the entire impact. He said he first thought the vehicle had simply stalled, but when he saw Darlene's body pinned in the doorway, he jumped out of his car and ran toward her. The engine was still revving in gear, wheels spinning against the curb. He tried pulling the handle, but the twisted door was jammed against the post. Another driver shouted for someone to turn off the ignition. A woman reached through the passenger side to switch it off, but by then there was no movement from Darlene. The cafe staff locked the drive-through window and called emergency services, while the line of cars backed away to give space. Responders later said that the position of the SUV and the bent metal frame made extraction difficult. It took several minutes to pry the door loose enough to reach her paramedics. Later noted severe chest trauma, consistent with high compression from the door hinge. Investigators pieced together the timeline mostly from her own phone. The video began with her ordering coffee and continued all the way through her shouting at staff, walking back to the SUV, and getting in. The final image froze on the steering wheel a split second before the sound of impact. Authorities classified the death as accidental, caused by blunt force injuries to the chest. They noted there was no evidence of mechanical failure, only driver error combined with distraction. Witnesses confirmed that the outburst over the half-filled cup lasted nearly 3 minutes before the fatal moment. By evening, the cafe reopened the lane. The bent post stayed for days while the video remained unreleased, though investigators confirmed it captured the full argument. The case was ruled an accidental death, a fatal mistake that turned an ordinary argument over coffee into a tragedy. It was May 3, 2017, in Mesa, Arizona, on a warm, clear afternoon. The grocery store's parking lot was busy, with carts moving between rows and cars shifting slowly through the front drive. Sun glare bounced off windshields, making it harder for drivers to see pedestrians stepping into the lane. One of the shoppers leaving the store was 42-year-old Dana Mullis, a medical billing clerk known in her neighborhood for arguing over small issues and demanding managers for minor problems. And that afternoon was no different. Witnesses said that inside the store she had already caused a scene over expired coupons, insisting the cashier honor them anyway, and asking for the manager twice. Several shoppers saw her leave the checkout line visibly frustrated. Dana walked toward her sedan parked in one of the closest spaces. At the same time, a compact car pulled into the stall beside hers, stopping slightly over the painted line. According to people loading groceries nearby, Dana noticed instantly and launched into complaints, waving her arms at the driver and demanding they fix how they parked. Those who witnessed it said she spoke loudly enough that several rows of shoppers turned to follow the scene. As the exchange continued, Dana stepped backward while still facing the compact car. Witnesses later said she made small, abrupt backward steps, more yelling, another step, more pointing, without looking behind her. The store's security camera showed that she moved into the drive lane at an angle, still engaged in the midst of the argument. At the same time, a pickup truck was turning through the lane toward the store exit at roughly 8 to 10 miles per hour. The driver later explained that a large SUV parked near the corner blocked his view of anyone walking out between the cars. As he turned, the truck's front fender cleared the blind spot just as Dana backed into the lane. Footage showed the driver hit the brakes immediately, but the distance was too short. The truck made contact with Dana at low speed. Witnesses estimated it looked similar to a parking lot bump, but because she was already leaning backward and unprepared, the impact spun her off balance. A shopper pushing a cart said she fell straight back, striking the back of her head on the rounded edge of the concrete curb. The sound made several people stop in place. The truck stopped immediately, and Dana remained unresponsive. A trained bystander checked her airway, while another called for help. Store staff brought a first aid kit and cleared the area. Fire department medics arrived within minutes, assessed her severe head injury, and prepared her for transport. Later that evening, authorities confirmed that Dana died from severe blunt head trauma caused by the backward fall. The medical report noted that the low-speed impact alone was not fatal, but the unbraced fall onto the curb created enough force to cause a catastrophic injury. In the weeks that followed, the store repainted crosswalk lines, added a pedestrian-only walkway in front of the main row, and posted signs reminding customers to watch for moving cars before stepping backward into the lane. It was February 6, 2018 in Toledo, Ohio. Snow lined the sidewalks of a quiet residential block where a row of duplexes sat under dim streetlights. Inside one unit, the evening was uneventful. Maintenance requests were normally handled through a standard property system, with non-urgent issues scheduled days in advance. Nothing about the night suggested it would end in an emergency. Marcia Klein was 39 and worked in retail management. Co-workers described her as demanding and impatient, often escalating minor issues into confrontations. She expected immediate results and treated delays as personal slights. That same attitude had followed her home. Over several months, she had repeatedly clashed with property management, calling frequently and accusing staff of negligence over small inconveniences. That evening, a decorative glass lamp in her living room stopped working. It was not wired into the unit and had no connection to the building's electrical system. Property management explained that decorative items were the tenant's responsibility and did not qualify for emergency repair. Marcia reacted angrily, accusing staff of refusing to do their jobs and threatening to withhold rent. After several minutes of shouting, she ended the call and decided to fix the problem herself. Rather than replacing the lamp or waiting for a repair service, Marcia searched online and convinced herself the issue was a simple wiring fault. She believed professional repairs were unnecessary and intentionally overpriced. Ignoring manufacturer warnings printed on the lamp's base, she retrieved a screwdriver and extension cord from a storage closet. She placed the lamp on her kitchen counter near the stovetop and began dismantling its base. The wiring inside showed visible heat damage and fraying. Instead of disconnecting power, Marcia plugged the lamp into an outlet to test it while continuing to work. When the lamp failed to turn on, she repositioned it closer to the stove to improve visibility, inadvertently resting the cord against an active burner. Within minutes, the insulation on the cord began to melt. As Marcia leaned over the counter, the exposed wiring sparked, the cord ignited, and flames spread quickly up the plastic casing and into the lamp's base. Startled, Marcia attempted to pull the cord away, but the fire intensified, producing thick black smoke. The smoke filled the small kitchen rapidly. Instead of evacuating, Marcia attempted to smother the flames with a dish towel, which ignited immediately. Disoriented and coughing, she stumbled backward and collapsed near the kitchen doorway. The fire burned itself out shortly after consuming the cord and lamp base. A neighbor in the adjoining unit noticed the smell of smoke and called emergency services. Responders arrived to find Marcia unresponsive inside the smoke-filled apartment. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was smoke inhalation, with high levels of carbon monoxide and soot found in her lungs. Fire investigators ruled the incident accidental, caused by improper electrical handling and refusal to disconnect power during a repair attempt. Property management records documented repeated warnings about unauthorized repairs. The case was closed without charges. Investigators noted the death was preventable and directly linked to unsafe behavior during an unnecessary confrontation with a routine household issue. It was September 7, 2017, in Sedona, Arizona, at a crowded Red Rock overlook where clear skies and calm weather drew steady foot traffic throughout the day. The view appeared stable and inviting, but erosion beneath the surface had weakened the edge, leaving little margin for error near the steep drop. Dana Pike was 28 and worked as a hairstylist at a mid-range salon outside Phoenix. She was reliable with clients, steady with coloring work, and focused on moving into a better shop. She used social media to support that goal, filming short travel videos meant to show confidence and polish. Nothing was sponsored, but she treated visibility as professional leverage. She planned the Sedona trip around filming. Dana preferred shots taken close to open space, where the background looked wide and uninterrupted. Friends said she disliked being hurried and often held her position once she set up. She carried a small tripod, a phone with a wide-angle lens, and wore smooth-soled sneakers. She had no training in climbing or rock stability and assumed that a popular overlook was safe because it was frequently used. That afternoon, hikers moved in and out of the overlook, taking turns at the front edge. Dana set her tripod near the front and began recording. People behind her asked to pass. She waved them off and continued filming, speaking toward the phone while holding her spot. A small sign and a line of rocks marked where visitors were advised to stop. She stepped beyond that line to widen the frame. The surface looked level, but the rock was fractured sandstone shaped by erosion. Shallow cracks were visible on top, with larger voids underneath. The area had been flagged informally by rangers but remained open. Dana adjusted her stance, turned her upper body toward the camera, and placed her right heel close to a thin seam in the rock. The first break was minor. A sharp crack was heard as a small piece of stone snapped loose, and her heel dropped slightly. She reacted by spreading her arms and shifting her weight outward. The crack widened immediately. A larger section of rock tilted forward, scraping as it began to slide. The slab detached completely. Dana fell with it, dropping roughly 200 feet down a steep field of loose rock. Her shoulder struck first, twisting her body. Her head hit next, followed by her chest. She continued to tumble, striking jagged stone multiple times before stopping against a cluster of boulders below. Dana's tripod remained standing near the boundary. Her phone was recovered nearby, still recording, capturing the cracking sound, a sudden rush of air, and the image spinning upward before stopping. Emergency services were called immediately, but access was limited by terrain. Ranger teams reached the area on foot first, followed by paramedics. Dana showed no signs of life when responders arrived, and death was pronounced at the scene. The coroner reported multiple blunt force injuries. Her skull was fractured with severe brain damage. Several ribs were broken, both lungs had collapsed, and there was extensive internal bleeding. The cause of death was massive trauma from a fall from height, with injuries that would have been fatal within minutes. The incident was confirmed through witness accounts, phone footage, and the displaced rock slab, which had broken cleanly from the edge. That section of the overlook was closed the same day. At the salon where Dana worked, co-workers placed an empty chair with her scissors and combs on the seat. Rangers later added clearer warnings and used the incident in safety briefings to explain how erosion can cause sudden failure, even in heavily visited areas. It was September 9, 2013, and the dinner rush at a fast food restaurant in Phoenix, Arizona, created a chaotic symphony of sizzling fryers, beeping timers, and shouted orders as teenage employees struggled to keep up with the demands of hungry customers. The temperature outside had reached 108 degrees, driving people indoors and creating longer than usual lines. Deborah Walsh adjusted her phone's camera settings as she prepared to document what she planned would be another successful confrontation with minimum wage workers. At 38, the dental receptionist had transformed complaining into an art form, visiting the same fast food location daily to find fault with everything from food temperature to service speed. Her phone's photo gallery contained hundreds of images of allegedly substandard meals, which she used as evidence in her frequent demands for free food. Deborah's daily routine involved strategic visits to fast food restaurants during peak hours, when stressed employees were most likely to make mistakes she could exploit. She had memorized corporate complaint procedures for dozens of chains and could recite specific policy numbers during her confrontations with teenage workers. The transformation from occasional complainer to professional food scammer had begun when Deborah discovered that aggressive behavior and threats of social media exposure could result in free meals and gift cards. She had developed increasingly elaborate schemes for manufacturing complaints, including bringing her own cold food to claim temperature violations. That evening, Deborah had arrived during the 6 p.m. dinner rush with her phone fully charged and her complaint strategy prepared. She ordered her standard meal and immediately began her inspection process, photographing the burger from multiple angles, while loudly commenting about its allegedly improper assembly. When the teenage cashier offered to remake the burger, Deborah rejected the solution and demanded to speak with the manager immediately. She began filming the interaction while explaining to other customers that she was documenting discrimination and poor service for social media exposure. The manager, a 19-year-old college student, politely addressed Deborah's complaints and offered multiple solutions, including a refund, replacement meal, or store credit. None of these options satisfied Deborah, who had come specifically to create a confrontation. Determined to get the perfect camera angle for her complaint video, Deborah climbed onto the service counter while continuing to film and lecture the employees. She wanted to capture what she claimed were health code violations in the kitchen area, despite having no knowledge of actual food safety regulations. While gesturing dramatically for her video and berating the teenage workers, Deborah stepped backward on the narrow counter to get a wider shot. She lost her footing and fell backward off the counter, striking her head on the hard tile floor with tremendous force. The impact caused severe head trauma and a fractured skull. Deborah Walsh died from massive brain injury within minutes of her fall, her phone still recording as she lay motionless on the restaurant floor. The footage from her phone showed that she had been planning to post the confrontation on social media with the caption "Exposing the fast food corruption," a post that was never published, leaving her followers to wonder what had happened to their daily dose of complaint content. It was October 4th, 2015. The afternoon sun beat down on an elementary school's parking lot in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where colorful booths and inflatable structures dotted the asphalt for the annual fall fair. Among the families navigating the carnival games stood Denise Calder, a 36-year-old part-time bookkeeper whose presence would turn an ordinary school fundraiser into a scene of unforgettable tragedy. Denise had worked sporadically for various small businesses around Albuquerque, never holding a position for too long. Co-workers described her as competent with numbers but volatile under pressure, prone to outbursts over minor workplace conflicts. She had been fired twice for confrontations with management. Her 8-year-old son Tyler was her primary focus, and she attended his school events religiously, often volunteering with an intensity that made other parents uncomfortable. The school fair featured typical attractions including ring toss booths, face painting stations, and several large inflatable structures powered by industrial fans. These inflatables, standing between 10 and 15 feet tall, were kept inflated by weighted metal fan units that maintained constant air pressure. Each fan base weighed approximately 60 pounds and was fitted with a heavy-gauge steel housing around the motor. Manufacturer guidance and event protocols required additional anchoring or sandbag weights on asphalt surfaces, but that day organizers relied only on the weight of the base. Tyler had been playing a ring toss game at a booth run by parent volunteers, attempting to land plastic rings on glass bottles for prizes. After multiple failed attempts and $5 spent, he walked away empty-handed and visibly upset. Denise approached the booth demanding another chance, her voice rising as she accused the volunteers of rigging the game. When they politely refused, explaining the rules applied equally to everyone, her agitation escalated. Rather than walking away, Denise pivoted toward the nearest inflatable structure, a 12-foot giraffe-shaped bounce house positioned adjacent to the game booth. Several children were playing inside as she reached the inflatable and grabbed the vinyl material with both hands. Witnesses reported she appeared to be attempting to forcefully pull it down or tip it over. The structure's tethered connection to its fan base created resistance, but Denise continued jerking the inflatable violently back and forth. The weighted fan base, sitting unsecured on the asphalt and lacking the recommended sandbag weights, began rocking with each pull. On Denise's fourth or fifth violent shake, the 60-pound metal unit tipped forward completely. The steel housing pivoted and struck her left temple with concentrated force as she leaned into another pull. She dropped instantly, her body crumpling onto the hot asphalt. Witnesses reported no movement from Denise after she fell. Children who had been playing inside the inflatable were pulled away by parents, many screaming. A volunteer called 911, and emergency medical services found Denise unresponsive with visible trauma to her head. Despite immediate intervention, she was pronounced dead at the scene minutes later. The medical examiner confirmed a depressed skull fracture with brain herniation, consistent with catastrophic blunt force trauma. The manner of death was ruled accidental, with investigators noting that the fatal injury occurred during her deliberate attempt to overturn the inflatable structure. The funeral was sparsely attended, with Tyler placed temporarily with Denise's sister in Las Cruces before entering long-term foster care. The elementary school removed all large inflatable structures from subsequent fairs, implemented a permanent ban on fan-powered attractions, and opened an internal safety review with the district insurer. It was September 10, 2016, in Plano, Texas, an early evening just after a passing thunderstorm. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving shallow puddles across the wide parking lot of a suburban grocery complex. The wet asphalt reflected the glow of overhead lights and the red brake beams of shoppers pulling out with weekend groceries. Rhonda Ellis, 46, was a self-employed real estate agent who managed several rental properties in the area. Tenants and co-workers described her as assertive, often getting into minor arguments over parking, delivery access, or who had the right to certain spaces. Her silver crossover SUV was parked several rows from the store entrance as she waited for her husband to arrive in a second vehicle. Around 6:20 p.m., a blue sedan turned into the same aisle. Security footage later showed it slowing as it approached an open parking space only a few feet from where Rhonda was standing. As the driver angled to pull in, Rhonda stepped forward and stood in the middle of the space, motioning with her hands for the car to stop. The sedan paused, blinkers still on. The driver rolled down the window and said something, but the camera's audio didn't pick it up. Witnesses nearby later told police they heard Rhonda insisting that the space was meant for her husband, who was on his way. When the driver gave up and turned toward another row, she remained standing there for a few seconds with her arms crossed before walking back toward her SUV, shaking her head. Footage showed her pulling a set of car keys from her jacket pocket and tossing them down in frustration. The keys bounced once and landed beside a metal light pole base, where water had pooled from the earlier rain. She walked over to pick them up, unaware that the metal housing around the pole's base had been corroded for months. Maintenance records would later show that the wiring inside had been flagged for repair twice earlier that year, but never serviced. Moisture from the storm had seeped into the cracked seal, exposing a live wire that made intermittent contact with the metal casing whenever it was wet. Rhonda crouched beside the pole and reached down with her right hand. According to two shoppers across the aisle, there was a sudden blue-white flash, followed by a loud pop. Rhonda's body stiffened, and she let out a single sharp scream before collapsing sideways onto the wet ground. Her right hand was still gripping the key ring, which was partly submerged in the shallow puddle. A man loading groceries into his truck stopped when he saw the flash and realized she had collapsed. He stepped forward but froze when he noticed small sparks dancing across the puddle around the pole. Others nearby hesitated too, unsure what had happened. One shopper yelled for everyone to stay back while someone inside the store alerted employees. Within minutes, workers used cones and carts to block off the aisle, as the smell of burned plastic and faint electrical crackling filled the air. Fire department responders reached the scene at 6:31 p.m. and immediately cut power to the entire lighting circuit for the lot. Paramedics approached once the voltage was confirmed off, but Rhonda was already unresponsive. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later identified electrocution as the cause of death, consistent with high-voltage contact through a conductive surface in standing water. Investigators found that corrosion in an underground junction had caused a short during the storm. Tests showed the current reached over 200 volts, strong enough to stop a heartbeat instantly. The store closed the section that night for inspection. Records revealed earlier repair requests were ignored. By the next day, city crews sealed all pole bases and added warning signs while planning full rewiring. It was February 11, 2018, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Dayton, Ohio. The sky was gray, the air cool, and residents were casually setting up tables for the community garage sale. Most people sorted boxes slowly, greeting neighbors and arranging items along their driveways without hurry. One of the participants was 46-year-old Carla Madsen, a part-time home organizer known for treating the annual sale like a competition. Her job involved critiquing how people arranged their spaces, and neighbors said she often carried that same attitude into community events. She had already told several people she intended to run the best table this year after feeling overlooked at the last sale. So when she stepped outside and decided her driveway looked too dim, her irritation started immediately. Carla flung open her garage and dragged out plastic bins filled with old decorations and household items. When one neighbor mentioned that the lighting wouldn't matter until buyers arrived later, Carla snapped back and accused them of undermining her setup. She shifted her bins around sharply, reorganizing and reorganizing her tables while muttering complaints each time something wasn't perfectly aligned. Still unhappy, she decided the driveway needed extra lighting. Instead of buying new equipment, she pulled out a plastic storage bin filled with extension cords she had collected over the years, some frayed, some taped, and one with a several-inch strip of exposed copper wire. When a nearby resident gently suggested that a few cords looked unsafe, Carla raised her voice, insisting everything worked fine last year and refusing the offer of a spare cord. She stretched the cords across her driveway toward the outdoor outlet, but instead of laying them flat, she dragged an old metal shelving rack closer to keep them out of the walkway. The bottom of the rack was damp from overnight moisture, and several witnesses said they saw her shoving it back and forth hard enough that it scraped loudly across the concrete. One neighbor later recalled hearing her muttering angrily as she tried to wedge the cords behind it. By 9:35 a.m., 2 cords were already plugged in. The light stayed off because the final connection had not been made yet. Carla crouched down with the damaged cord, the one with the exposed copper, and braced her other hand firmly on the damp metal rack as she reached toward the outlet. A man standing on his porch directly across the street reported seeing a quick blue flash under the rack, followed by a sharp popping snap. The exposed wiring had come into contact with the wet metal surface, energizing the entire frame. Because Carla was leaning on it for support, the current traveled through the rack and directly into her body. The same witness said he saw her body go rigid before she dropped face first onto the concrete. Several residents on the block later reported a brief flicker of lights inside their homes at the same moment. People approached her driveway but stopped short, unsure if the rack or outlet was still live. Someone yelled to cut the breaker, and a neighbor ran into the garage to shut it off, sending the lights dark at once. Emergency responders arrived minutes later, and neighbors watched from the sidewalk as paramedics assessed her, though no one close by could hear the details. Inspectors later reviewed the cords, outlet, and shelving rack. They concluded that the exposed copper, the damp metal surface, and Carla's direct hand contact created a complete electrical path the moment she tried to connect the final cord. Officials confirmed that she died at the scene from cardiac arrest, caused by fatal electrocution consistent with household current under wet contact conditions. The next day, her family removed all the old electrical supplies from the garage and hired a professional to update the wiring and replace the outdoor outlet. It was October 22, 2017, in Paramus, New Jersey. A major weekend sale packed a suburban shopping center with cars and pedestrians. Traffic stalled in narrow lanes, horns sounded, and shoppers moved between idling vehicles as congestion erased any margin for error. Lorraine Buckley was 51 and had shopped at the center for years. She planned her errands carefully and arrived that afternoon with a short list built around bundled discounts and limited quantity deals she didn't want to miss. She believed being early and prepared entitled her to move through the process without delays. When other shoppers disrupted that expectation, she tended to see it as unfair behavior rather than normal congestion. She preferred a specific parking area close to the main entrance, which she considered her usual spot due to how often she used it. That afternoon, she arrived expecting heavier traffic because of the sale, but did not anticipate how crowded the lot had become. As she crept through the lanes, frustration mounted. The delays conflicted with her plan to get inside quickly before popular items sold out. The parking lot was laid out with angled spaces, concrete wheel stops, and narrow drive lanes bordered by pedestrian walkways. A slight downhill grade ran through the central aisle, subtle, but enough to allow a vehicle to roll if it was not fully secured. Surveillance cameras mounted on tall light poles monitored entrances and several sections of the lot. After several minutes of waiting, Lorraine saw a vehicle back out of a space near the entrance, one she regularly used during past visits. Before she could reach it, another driver approached from the opposite direction and pulled in first. Lorraine slowed anyway, lingering in the lane as if the space had been hers to take. Traffic stacked behind Lorraine, blocking her path forward. Instead of continuing on, she stopped her car in the traffic lane and stepped out to confront the driver who had already parked, insisting the space had been hers to take. In her frustration, she left the engine running and did not fully place the transmission into park. The lane sloped slightly downhill. As Lorraine stood beside the open driver's door, the car began to roll backward. The movement was slow but steady. With the door open and a concrete parking barrier directly behind her, there was no space to step clear. Within seconds, the vehicle pinned her between the doorframe and the barrier. Nearby, shoppers witnessed her chest being compressed against the barrier and rushed to help. Several pushed the vehicle forward while another person climbed into the driver's seat to stop it. Emergency services were called immediately from nearby storefronts. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Lorraine unresponsive, suffering from severe blunt force trauma and ineffective breathing. Resuscitation efforts were attempted but unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was traumatic compression of the chest and abdomen, resulting in collapsed lungs and extensive internal bleeding. Investigators found no mechanical defects in the vehicle. Surveillance footage confirmed the car had not been secured before she exited and showed no interference by other drivers. The death was ruled accidental and attributed to driver error. The shopping center later installed additional signage reminding drivers not to stop in traffic lanes and to secure vehicles before exiting. The opposing driver was cleared of responsibility, and the case was closed after administrative review. It was July 22, 2018, on the Ocoee River in southeastern Tennessee, where scheduled summer releases had pushed cold water into fast, narrow channels. Commercial rafting trips were moving through in close succession, and while the river looked manageable from shore, strong recirculating currents were already forming around exposed rocks beneath the surface. Nina Harrow was 31 and worked as a retail shift supervisor at a home goods chain in Chattanooga. She was dependable, often covered extra shifts, and had begun posting frequently about assertiveness and taking control in everyday situations. Her posts were aimed at coworkers and friends, and focused on correcting others and stepping in when she felt direction was weak. She had no formal outdoor or river experience and relied mostly on general fitness and confidence rather than technical skill. She signed up for the rafting trip with coworkers as a group activity. The Ocoee was running controlled releases that day, higher and colder than normal, with several Class 3 and 4 rapids. The commercial section contained known hazard points, including mid-river boulders that created hydraulics capable of holding swimmers underwater. Guides depended on strict paddle commands, synchronized movement, and keeping all passengers seated low in the raft, because standing removed stability and control during rapid entry. At the launch point, the guide gave a standard safety briefing that covered paddle commands, body position, and the requirement to remain seated through rapids with feet tucked inside the raft. Nina interrupted more than once, making jokes about guides exaggerating danger and saying balance mattered more than following instructions exactly. The guide corrected her and continued, reminding the group that the rules applied to everyone. As the raft approached a known rapid with a lateral wave feeding into a downstream boulder, the guide called for a coordinated forward paddle to maintain alignment. Nina argued that a different angle would be better, and raised her voice over the sound of the water. As the raft entered the rapid slightly offline, she shifted her weight outward and stood on the outer tube with her arms spread, attempting to demonstrate stability. The lateral wave struck the upstream side of the raft, causing it to pitch and roll. With her weight elevated, Nina was thrown off first and hit the water near the downstream edge. The current immediately carried her toward the boulder, where water folded back on itself into a hydraulic that pulled her sideways and down. Video from a trailing raft and the guide's action camera showed her head breaking the surface briefly before being pulled under again. During one cycle, her chest struck the rock edge, forcing the air from her lungs. She surfaced for a moment, gasping, then was pulled back into the recirculating water. The guide threw a rope that brushed her arm but did not catch. A second throw landed closer, but the current dragged her under before she could grab it securely. After several cycles, 2 guides entered the water with ropes and used positioning to disrupt the hydraulic and pull her free into an eddy. She was unresponsive, with bluish skin and no effective breathing. CPR began immediately on shore while emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived approximately 12 minutes later and took over care, but she did not regain a pulse or spontaneous breathing. The medical examiner listed drowning as the primary cause of death, with contributing blunt trauma. Her lungs were bruised, several ribs were fractured, and deep chest contusions were present from repeated impacts against rock. In plain terms, she was held underwater repeatedly and struck hard enough to prevent breathing or effective movement. The incident was documented by guide footage and bystander video, which showed the sequence clearly from the moment she stood up to the rescue attempt. The outfitter reviewed procedures afterward and reinforced briefings about staying seated in rapids. Nina's workplace later organized a small safety fundraiser for regional water rescue training, presented as a reminder that ignoring instructions in hazardous environments can have immediate consequences. It was July 22, 2017, and the scorching afternoon heat of Fresno, California, created shimmering waves above the vast asphalt parking lot of the Walmart Supercenter as hundreds of shoppers navigated the maze of cars searching for available spaces. The temperature had reached 104 degrees, making tempers run even hotter than usual. Linda Martinez sat in her air-conditioned Honda Civic, surveying the parking lot through binoculars while making detailed notes in a spiral notebook dedicated to documenting what she perceived as shopping cart violations. At 45, the bank teller had transformed shopping cart enforcement into her personal crusade, spending her weekends patrolling shopping centers and confronting customers who failed to return their carts to designated areas. Her car's console contained homemade violation notices, a digital camera, and a measuring tape for documenting cart abandonment. Linda's obsession with shopping cart justice had begun 2 years earlier when she witnessed a runaway cart scratch her car in a parking lot, leading her to study store policies and develop an encyclopedic knowledge of shopping cart etiquette. She had appointed herself a vigilante enforcer, photographing abandoned carts and lecturing shoppers about their civic responsibilities. The escalation from documenting violations to actively confronting other shoppers had been gradual, starting with polite reminders about cart return policies and evolving into aggressive confrontations. Linda carried business cards identifying herself as a shopping cart compliance volunteer and would lecture customers about the social contract of shared retail spaces. That afternoon, Linda spotted a family loading groceries into their minivan while their empty shopping cart sat unattended nearby, slowly rolling toward other parked cars in the 104-degree heat. Determined to ensure they learned proper cart etiquette, Linda marched over to confront them about their negligent behavior. When the family finished loading their groceries and prepared to leave, Linda positioned herself directly behind their cart and launched into her prepared speech about shopping cart responsibility. The frustrated parents dealing with tired children and melting frozen foods in the extreme heat tried to retrieve their cart to return it properly. Instead of allowing them to take the cart, Linda grabbed it and began pushing it back toward their vehicle while shouting about civic duty and retail courtesy. She was determined to complete her lecture about proper shopping cart etiquette, even as she backed the heavy metal cart toward the family's minivan at approximately 2 miles per hour. Linda, focused on her lecture and not watching where she was going, backed directly into the path of another shopper's SUV that was slowly reversing out of a parking space. The late afternoon glare off parked car windshields and Linda's crouched position behind the cart made her nearly invisible in the SUV's rearview mirror. The driver, checking their mirrors for pedestrians, didn't see her until it was too late. Linda was struck by the reversing vehicle and knocked to the ground, suffering massive head trauma that killed her within minutes. The driver was initially questioned, but security footage clearly showed Linda's erratic behavior and her failure to watch for traffic while pursuing her cart crusade. Her car contained over 3,000 photographs of abandoned shopping carts, evidence of an obsession that had consumed her life and ultimately caused her death. It was July 29, 2018. The evening air in Great Smoky Mountains National Park near Gatlinburg, Tennessee, hung thick and humid as campers settled into their sites along the wooded campground. Lacey Lee Turner, a 33-year-old retail worker from Knoxville, stood beside her sedan with her phone positioned on the hood, preparing to capture what she hoped would be her viral breakthrough. The black bear she had been baiting for 3 consecutive nights now lingered just 15 feet away, drawn by the scent of food she had deliberately scattered. At work, Lacey was known for arguing with supervisors, demanding policy exceptions, and escalating minor disagreements into formal complaints. Co-workers described her as someone who routinely asked to speak to managers and threatened to go corporate when she felt disrespected. That same combative personality carried into her online life. She spent most of her off hours cultivating a social media presence built around outrage, entitlement, and defiance, framing herself as someone who stood up to authority. By 2018, she had accumulated roughly 2,400 followers by posting wildlife encounter content from repeated camping trips to the Smokies, often pairing the clips with captions mocking rules, experts, and critics who warned her to stop. The Smoky Mountains host approximately 1,500 black bears across 500,000 acres of protected wilderness. Park regulations strictly prohibit feeding wildlife or storing food improperly, as habituated bears become dangerous and often must be euthanized. Rangers had cited Lacey twice that week for leaving coolers and food scraps outside her tent, warning her that attracting bears was illegal and potentially fatal, and that fed bears are frequently destroyed for public safety. She dismissed their concerns, posting photos of the citations with mocking captions about overprotective authorities. That evening, Lacey had escalated her baiting strategy. She spread honey-coated granola bars in a deliberate trail leading from the tree line to her campsite. A roughly 300-pound adult male black bear followed the scent trail as darkness approached. When the bear reached her immediate area, Lacey grabbed a long stick she had coated with honey and peanut butter, stepping directly into the animal's path. Multiple campers from adjacent sites watched with growing alarm as Lacey cornered the bear between her vehicle and a large oak tree, waving the stick while her phone recorded from a fixed angle atop the car hood. The bear displayed obvious stress signals, making huffing sounds and swaying its head while shifting its weight and hesitating. Lacey moved closer, extending the stick toward the animal's face. Two campers began shouting warnings, but she ignored them completely. The bear struck suddenly, moving with startling speed for its size. It rose briefly on its hind legs in a reflexive motion, then swiped with its right paw, connecting with Lacey's neck and upper chest before driving her sideways into her car door. She collapsed onto the gravel campsite. Blood poured from ragged lacerations across her throat and shoulder, and the bear immediately fled into the forest after the initial contact. The nearest camper, a retired firefighter, reached Lacey within seconds and attempted to control the bleeding using a towel, but the neck wounds were catastrophic. His wife called emergency services at 7:43 p.m., while other campers ran to alert park staff. Park rangers arrived 14 minutes later, followed by paramedics who transported Lacey to a regional medical center. She was pronounced dead at 8:34 p.m. The medical examiner determined death resulted from massive trauma to the neck, causing complete airway collapse and severe blood loss from severed arteries. Park officials tracked and located the bear in the surrounding area, euthanizing it 2 days later after linking it to the incident through investigative findings that included DNA recovered from the scene. Lacey's phone footage was secured and forensically copied by park authorities as part of the investigative record, never released publicly. It was November 8, 2015, in Mesa, Arizona, a dry, cool afternoon that brought steady weekend traffic into the Crosswinds shopping plaza. Inside the strip mall's small pet store, the usual chatter of birds and hum of aquarium filters filled the air. Employees were busy tending to customers buying food, tanks, and small animals. At around 3:20 p.m., the store's front counter area became the scene of an argument that would end in a sudden and tragic accident. The customer was 39-year-old Sharon Malloy, an office administrator and divorced mother of one who lived a few miles away. She was a regular at the store, often stopping by for bird feed and supplies. Employees described her as outspoken, known for questioning prices and frequently asking for discounts on items she thought were overpriced. That day, Sharon came in asking about a small parakeet she'd seen on a previous visit. The bird had been part of a local rescue program that worked with the shop, and its adoption fee was listed at $25 to cover care and medical costs. According to witnesses, Sharon argued that the store shouldn't charge for rescued animals. She spoke loudly enough that nearby customers turned to look. The employee at the counter, a college student working part-time, tried explaining that the fee went to the rescue organization, not the store itself. Sharon didn't accept the explanation and kept arguing, insisting the fee was unfair. She lifted a small metal bird cage from her cart and began pointing out its flaws: bent bars, a loose latch, chipped paint along the bottom edge. Witnesses said she waved it slightly as she spoke, her movements sharp enough that the employee stepped back from the counter. The store's security footage showed Sharon setting the cage down hard on the counter, then lifting it again in frustration. Behind her, another customer quietly moved away from the register area. When she slammed the cage down a second time, its lower edge struck the electrical cord of a heat lamp that was clamped to a reptile tank nearby. The lamp jolted loose and dropped behind the counter, hitting a plastic bottle of glass cleaner stored on a lower shelf. The cleaner contained ammonia and alcohol-based solvents. common in commercial products but highly flammable. The bulb, still hot from continuous use, shattered on impact. In the same instant, the escaping vapor ignited, producing a brief but intense flash. Employees described hearing a sharp pop and seeing a burst of orange flame that spread upward from the floor to the counter. Sharon's blouse, made of lightweight polyester, caught fire almost immediately. Surveillance video later showed her stepping back in shock, waving her arms as the fabric began to melt against her skin. 2 employees rushed forward. One grabbed a towel from the grooming station, while another unplugged the lamp's power cord. They managed to smother the flames within seconds, but by then Sharon had suffered severe burns to her upper torso and right arm. A customer ran outside to flag down a passing patrol car, and the officer radioed for paramedics. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and transported Sharon to a nearby burn center. She was pronounced dead later that evening due to thermal injuries and secondary complications from smoke inhalation. The fire department investigation concluded that the ignition was accidental, but preventable. Inspectors noted that the lamp's power cord had been improperly routed near cleaning supplies, and the clamp securing the fixture to the tank had loosened from repeated use. Although the heat output was within normal range, contact with the flammable vapors was enough to start the flash fire. Investigators ruled the fire an accident caused by unsafe equipment placement, with no criminal charges filed. The store closed for cleanup and repairs as inspectors documented burn damage across the counter and shelving. It reopened a week later with new glass enclosures for all heat lamps, added safety guards, and warning signs reminding customers to keep items clear of electrical cords. It was June 28, 2017, at a public pool in Fairview, Washington, a small suburban city preparing for its busiest swim season. The afternoon was warm, and a steady line had formed at the entrance. Families carried towels, sunscreen, and pool toys, while the posted rules beside the gate reminded guests that outside food and drinks were not permitted past the check-in area. Standing in line with a large iced coffee was 41-year-old Denise Halbrook, known among neighbors for heated confrontations over small regulations. Residents who lived near her townhouse described her as someone who often demanded to speak to management whenever things didn't go her way. The staff at a local grocery store had previously documented disputes with her over return policies, discount limits, and parking spaces. That afternoon at the pool, her behavior followed the same pattern. As she approached the front desk, the teenage attendant repeated the policy: no outside food or drinks. Most guests either finished their drinks or tossed them. Denise didn't. Witnesses said her posture changed immediately. She raised her voice, waved her coffee cup, and argued that she'd paid too much to give it up. She compared the rule to a nearby town's pool and leaned toward the counter, pointing at the sign while criticizing it loudly. The attendant repeated the standard response, but Denise grew more agitated, questioning his authority and gesturing with the cup. When nothing changed, CCTV showed her abruptly dumping the entire drink across the check-in computer. Coffee splashed over the keyboard, ran down the cords, and the monitor flickered as the system shorted. The attendant stepped back while the lifeguard supervisor signaled for help. People in line shuffled away, unsure what she would do next. After being told police were being contacted, witnesses said Denise muttered angrily and backed away from the counter, still shouting. Security footage showed her taking several quick steps backward without looking behind her. The ground had a thin, slick layer of water from swimmers all afternoon. According to bystanders, her heel slipped the moment it touched the wet patch. One person reported seeing her arm jerk outward as she tried to catch herself, but her momentum carried her back. CCTV captured her foot skidding, her body dropping, and her head striking the concrete edge with a loud impact. She did not move afterward. A bystander called for space while the supervisor dialed 911. Parents pulled their children aside as staff kept the walkway clear. EMTs arrived within minutes, assessed her where she fell, and witnesses said it was clear she remained unresponsive throughout. Later that afternoon, officials confirmed Denise Halbrook died from severe head trauma caused by hitting the concrete. Security footage showed the entire sequence: Her argument at the desk, the backward steps into a wet area, the slip, and the fatal impact. The pool added more non-slip mats and strengthened procedures for enforcing gate rules during crowded hours. It was December 17, 2017 in Quezon City, Philippines. A small Christmas gathering was underway inside a mid-rise condominium unit, decorated with string lights, a compact artificial tree, and wrapped gifts clustered beneath it. The unit was warm and crowded, with movement flowing between the living room and a narrow hallway that led toward the building's interior stairwell. Holiday music played softly, and the mood was relaxed as the group prepared for a simple exchange gift. Marissa Delgado was 42 and had joined 3 close friends for the exchange. Although the gift rules had been agreed on well in advance, she had postponed shopping until the last minute and arrived with an unwrapped item in a plain bag. Inside the unit, she barely glanced at the decorations. Her focus went straight to the gifts beneath the tree, particularly a large box positioned near the front, which she immediately associated with higher value. The group settled into the living room and began the exchange gift. Names were drawn casually, and gifts were handed out one by one. When it was Marissa's turn, she received the smallest package. Inside was a purse bag, new, clean, and appropriate for the exchange. Others smiled, but Marissa's expression tightened. The size difference stood out to her. She glanced repeatedly at the larger gift beneath the tree, convinced it represented better value. As the exchange wrapped up, Marissa grew visibly agitated. She fixated on fairness, replaying the moment in her head. Instead of letting it go, she stood and moved into the hallway, signaling for one friend to follow. The narrow corridor led past the unit's entrance toward a concrete stairwell used as a secondary exit. The lighting there was dimmer, and the sound of the party faded behind them. The discussion escalated quickly. Marissa paced while gesturing, insisting the exchange had been uneven and that she had been shortchanged. She stepped backward as she spoke, focused on the argument rather than her footing. The stairwell door behind her had been left ajar earlier to allow airflow. There was no guardrail at the threshold, only a short landing before the steps dropped away. As she continued moving, her heel missed the top step. She lost balance and fell backward into the stairwell. Her body struck the concrete steps as she tumbled down a full flight, coming to rest on the landing below. The fall was witnessed immediately by the friend following her, who called out for help. The others rushed in and found Marissa motionless at the base of the stairs. Blood was visible around her head, and her breathing was irregular. Emergency services were called at once. Paramedics arrived within minutes and attempted resuscitation, but Marissa never regained consciousness. She was pronounced dead at the scene due to severe head trauma and internal injuries sustained in the fall. The medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and torso. Toxicology testing showed no drugs and only minimal alcohol. Investigators found no defects in the stairwell or building structure. The death was ruled accidental, caused by a loss of balance during an argument. The party ended immediately. The remaining gifts stayed under the tree, unopened. It was February 3, 2016, on a narrow residential access road in Phoenix, Arizona, where older homes backed onto a strip of cracked asphalt used by cars and motorcycles as a shortcut between 2 busier streets. The road carried steady evening traffic, and engine noise echoed between walls and fences as drivers passed through. Aaron Voss was 33 and lived in one of the corner properties bordering the road. For months, she had complained about traffic noise, arguing that the road cut too close to her property line and was being used improperly. She believed the city had failed to enforce boundaries and that drivers were trespassing through what she considered part of her land. That evening, after another surge of cars and motorcycles passed through, Aaron stepped into the roadway and began shouting at a driver who slowed near her driveway. She accused the driver of illegally using the road and claimed it was private property. The argument drew attention from nearby homes, and Aaron raised her phone to record, positioning herself directly in the center of the lane to block traffic. The driver stopped several feet away and argued back through the open window, pointing out that the road was marked as public access. Aaron refused to move and continued filming, pacing in front of the car and gesturing at the pavement. She insisted the noise was unbearable and said she had had enough, declaring that no vehicles would pass. As the confrontation continued, Aaron lowered herself onto the asphalt, first sitting cross-legged, then lying flat on her back across the center of the road. She positioned her phone on her chest, still recording, and spread her arms slightly outward as if to force drivers to stop. The stopped car remained in place, its headlights angled slightly away due to the road's curve. At the same time, another vehicle approached from behind the curve at low speed. The road lighting was uneven, and Aaron's dark clothing blended with the asphalt. The approaching driver did not see her body in the roadway until the headlight swept fully into the straightaway. The driver braked hard, but the distance was too short. The front bumper struck Aaron's legs first, knocking her backward. The car rolled over her lower body and torso before coming to a stop several feet ahead. The impact forced the air from her lungs and pinned her briefly beneath the undercarriage. Neighbors ran toward the scene as the driver exited the vehicle in shock. Aaron was unresponsive, with visible injuries to her legs and abdomen, and blood pooling beneath her. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found extensive blunt force trauma. Aaron was transported to the hospital but was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner later reported massive internal injuries, including a crushed pelvis, ruptured organs, and severe internal bleeding, explaining that the force of the vehicle caused injuries incompatible with survival. The death was ruled accidental, resulting from blunt force trauma sustained after lying in an active roadway. Afterward, the city reviewed the road designation and installed additional signage and reflective markers. The incident was cited in neighborhood meetings as a warning about road rage escalation and the danger of blocking live traffic to prove a point. It was November 18, 2014, and the cozy atmosphere of Grind Coffee House in Portland, Oregon, filled with the familiar sounds of espresso machines, quiet conversations, and the gentle clicking of laptop keyboards. The converted warehouse space featured exposed brick walls, vintage furniture, and large windows that provided natural light for dozens of freelancers, students, and remote workers. Brenda Morrison arranged her laptop, external monitor, and graphic design materials across 2 tables near the main Wi-Fi router, creating a makeshift office that she defended with territorial instincts. At 52, the freelance graphic designer had appointed herself the unofficial monitor of public Wi-Fi usage, timing other customers with a stopwatch and confronting anyone who exceeded what she considered reasonable internet time. Her daily routine involved arriving at opening time to claim the best spot and aggressively defending her territory. Brenda's obsession with Wi-Fi policing had developed over the past year as her graphic design business struggled, and she spent increasingly long hours in coffee shops. She had created elaborate theories about bandwidth theft and internet freeloading, convinced that other customers were deliberately slowing down her connection to sabotage her work. The transformation from quiet customer to Wi-Fi vigilante had been gradual, beginning with polite suggestions about sharing internet resources and escalating to aggressive confrontations with college students and other freelancers. Brenda had been asked to leave multiple establishments for harassing customers, but she always returned the next day with renewed determination. That morning, Brenda had noticed a college student working on what appeared to be a research paper, his laptop open for over 2 hours. In Brenda's mind, this constituted bandwidth theft that was directly impacting her ability to upload large graphic design files to clients. Brenda marched over to the student's table with her stopwatch in hand, launching into a loud lecture about Wi-Fi etiquette. When the student ignored her and kept working, she escalated by attempting to disconnect the main router from the wall. The device was mounted about 8 feet up to prevent tampering, but Brenda was determined to reach it and assert her control. She dragged over an old wooden chair that had been part of the coffee shop's vintage furniture collection. The chair showed signs of wear and had a loose leg that the staff had been meaning to repair. Brenda climbed onto the unstable chair, stretching to reach the router while continuing to lecture the room about internet freeloading. Employees shouted for her to get down, but the moment passed too quickly for anyone to reach her. The old wooden chair, weakened by years of use, collapsed under her weight. She fell backward from the 8-foot height, her head striking the concrete floor with tremendous force. The impact caused severe head trauma and a fractured skull. Brenda Morrison lost consciousness immediately and died from massive brain injury before paramedics could arrive. Her fall had been witnessed by dozens of customers who called 911, but the damage from hitting the concrete floor was too severe to survive. Investigators found that Brenda had been documenting other customers' internet usage in a detailed journal, including photos and personal information, a discovery that raised questions about whether her Wi-Fi policing was masking more serious stalking behavior. It was February 11, 2016. The morning heat in suburban Brisbane, Queensland, was already climbing past 82 degrees Fahrenheit by 10 o'clock. Tanya Rowe, a 39-year-old casual cleaner living in a weatherboard rental property on the city's western fringe, stood in her backyard staring at the wooden utility pole that serviced her block. Tanya worked irregular shifts cleaning offices and retail spaces across Brisbane. Friends described her as fiercely independent, but increasingly paranoid about corporations and government agencies. She spent hours each day on local community Facebook groups and neighborhood forums, posting lengthy complaints about utility bills and demanding immediate refunds. Tanya had a knack for escalating small disputes into public spectacles. She routinely tagged counselors in her posts, left scathing one-star reviews, and threatened media exposure if she wasn't placated. Her online behavior, frequent public shaming, blunt private messages to neighbors who disagreed, and recorded phone calls she posted as proof of harassment, had earned her a reputation around the block as the person who never let a grievance go. This distrust had hardened over years of financial struggles and mounting debts. Electrical service poles carry high-voltage distribution lines that step down power from the main grid to individual properties. Live service supplies in Australia are nominally 230 volts for single-phase service, and up to 415 volts across multiple phases, enough to cause instant cardiac arrest and severe burns upon contact. When a property's power is cut off, the meter usually stops electricity from flowing into the house, but the wires above can still be live unless the utility fully shuts off the service at the main network connection. That morning, Tanya told her neighbor she was going to fix the power herself. She borrowed a set of household tools, including pliers and screwdrivers, from another tenant in her building, and retrieved an old reflective safety vest she had found at a worksite months earlier. The vest gave her an air of legitimacy, making witnesses assume she was an authorized contractor. She positioned an aluminum extension ladder against the pole around 11:30 in the morning. 3 neighbors saw Tanya climb the pole, wearing the reflective vest and carrying the tools in a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Tanya had no electrical training, no insulated gloves, no safety harness, and no understanding of what she was attempting. The ladder itself was metal, creating an additional conduction risk. Tanya reached the service connection point approximately 30 feet above ground around noon. The moment her tool contacted the live multi-phase service line, a massive electrical current surged through her body. Witnesses described a sharp metallic crack consistent with an electrical arc, heard by nearby residents. Tanya's body went rigid, locked in tetanic contraction as electricity overrode her nervous system. The arc flash damaged the tool and broke her contact with the conductor, and she separated from the pole. She fell 30 feet straight down, striking the compacted dirt and gravel beside the ladder. 2 neighbors sprinted across immediately, but found her unconscious with severe visible burns on her right hand and forearm. Paramedics arrived within minutes following a neighbor's call, but Tanya showed no pulse or respiratory activity. She was declared deceased at the scene. The coroner determined death resulted from electrocution causing immediate cardiac arrest, compounded by catastrophic blunt force trauma from the fall, including skull fracture and internal bleeding. Authorities charged no one but referred the case to workplace safety authorities as a warning example. Her funeral was held at a small chapel in Brisbane, attended mostly by neighbors and a few distant relatives. Her social media accounts were deactivated at her parents' request. It was May 13, 2017, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. A warm Saturday morning when the aisles of a local discount supermarket were packed with weekend shoppers. The steady hum of carts and checkout scanners filled the air. At Register 6, the line stretched nearly to the back of the produce section as people waited to pay for groceries and household items. Among them was Patricia Larkin, known by many in her neighborhood as Patty. She was 52, a retired librarian who lived alone on the east side of town. Former co-workers described her as outspoken, someone who never hesitated to correct others in public if she thought they were wrong. She came to the store regularly, often mid-morning on weekends when lines were longest. At around 10:40 a.m., surveillance footage later showed Patty pushing her cart past at least 5 customers in line at the self-checkout area. She positioned her cart directly behind another shopper who was placing items on the conveyor. A man in his 30s wearing a gray sweatshirt told her the end of the line was behind him. Witnesses said she looked straight at him and raised her voice, saying she didn't have time to deal with delays. Several people in line turned their heads as her voice carried through the checkout area. The man repeated himself, gesturing toward the line that extended behind the soda display. Instead of moving, Patty gripped her cart and pushed it forward, striking the back of the man's legs. The sound of metal wheels against the tile floor made several people step back. A store employee at the service counter began walking toward the commotion, but before he reached them, multiple shoppers had already started recording with their phones. The video later confirmed that the man did not retaliate. He stepped aside, raising his hands in disbelief, while Patty began unloading her groceries onto the belt. One of the witnesses, a woman near the express lane, told investigators that Patty seemed flustered and was muttering under her breath as she reached for items from her cart. Her movements were quick and jerky. Another customer, standing 2 registers away, said she complained that the store needed better trained staff. At that point, the manager on duty, identified later in reports as David Hall, approached from the customer service counter. He stood a few feet away and asked her to step aside to resolve the issue calmly. Patty turned, one hand still gripping her cart handle. Her body was angled halfway between the belt and the aisle divider. The surveillance footage captured what happened next. As she turned to respond, the front wheel of her shopping cart caught the edge of the metal guardrail that lined the base of the conveyor. When she tried to shift her foot, her right shoe slipped between the small gap near the rail. The cart tilted slightly, and she instinctively yanked her leg back to free herself. That movement caused her to lose balance. She stumbled backward, her arms flailing briefly before her body hit the floor. Her head struck the corner of a low-standing freezer that held packaged meat products near the checkout area. The impact produced a dull, heavy sound that was clearly audible on the store's security audio. Witnesses said the entire area went silent. A woman screamed for help, and several shoppers backed away, leaving their carts behind. The man she had argued with stood motionless, still holding his phone. The manager knelt beside Patty, who remained unresponsive. Another employee called 911 from the service counter while customers began clearing the surrounding lanes. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but emergency personnel later confirmed she had sustained a fatal skull fracture and brain hemorrhage from the impact. Security footage showed that the entire confrontation, from the moment she cut the line to the moment she fell, lasted less than 2 minutes. Store policy required a full shutdown of the affected checkout area, and customers were redirected to the remaining lanes. By 11:15 a.m., yellow tape surrounded registers 6 and 7, while police reviewed footage and took statements. Her cart remained across 2 lanes, half filled with groceries. Investigators ruled the death an accidental fall caused by imbalance and blunt force trauma. The store reopened that evening, adding padding to the freezer corner involved in the incident. It was August 14, 2018, in the coastal town of Pacifica, California, a warm, late morning with steady waves and light wind along the shoreline. Weekend crowds filled the beach, and a small local cable crew collected background footage for a lifestyle segment, wide shots of surfers, vendors, and swimmers moving in the water. One of the beachgoers was 42-year-old Melissa Davenport, familiar to regulars for her habit of correcting strangers and challenging staff. She worked as a freelance event planner, and neighbors said she often carried that assertive attitude everywhere she went. Weighing around 240 pounds, she used a wide, soft-top longboard for stability, since she wasn't an experienced surfer. Earlier that morning, witnesses said she was already paddling beyond the beginner zone, speaking loudly about how she understood the water better than the staff monitoring conditions. Regular surfers noted she'd been warned repeatedly about the breakwater currents on past visits, but she brushed off every caution as unnecessary advice meant for inexperienced riders. Lifeguards had issued early warnings about a strong side current pushing toward the old breakwater at the north end. One guard approached Melissa as she dragged her board toward the water, reminding her to stay within the main swim zone. Melissa immediately raised her voice, insisting the warnings were exaggerated and that she was not some beginner needing constant supervision. When the guard pointed out that her ankle leash was loose, she dismissed him, saying it felt restrictive and she would adjust it later. That looseness left extra slack in the cord, which later allowed the board to drift just far enough for the leash to snap tight with force. The cable crew's roaming camera briefly captured Melissa walking into the surf, while making comments to nearby swimmers about lifeguards power tripping. She paddled past the first breaking waves, continuing to talk loudly about how people exaggerate currents to scare tourists. The current pushed her steadily northward, but she ignored repeated gestures from the lifeguard tower to angle back toward the center. She tried to stand, but the front edge of her board dipped under the surface. The board tilted forward, and she fell off. Witnesses said she attempted to surface immediately, but the side current had already pushed her board toward the submerged rocks near the breakwater. According to several beachgoers, Melissa surfaced once, coughing, with her arms moving toward the board. As the current pushed the longboard into the rocks, the leash reached full tension. Witnesses said they saw her body jerk downward when the stretched leash pulled her underwater. People on the breakwater reported hearing her yell moments before the current rotated her sideways. A small retreating wave pulled her in the direction of the rocks again, and her head lifted above the water only briefly. Footage from the cable crew's distant camera later confirmed that the longboard had drifted into the breakwater, its nose catching on a submerged lip of stone. The board stayed wedged at an angle while the current continued to push water past it. A few seconds later, beachgoers closest to the breakwater reported hearing a single dull impact, consistent with her head striking one of the submerged stone surfaces beneath the chop. Lifeguards went in immediately, with one calling for backup as the other swam toward her. A brief lull in the current allowed them to pull her to shore, but she showed no movement when they lifted her above the waterline. CPR began right away, and beach staff cleared the area. EMTs arrived about 5 minutes after the emergency call and took over the resuscitation efforts, continuing CPR while assessing her condition. Their work lasted only a short time before they signaled to stop. Officials later confirmed that Melissa Davenport died from blunt head trauma, consistent with striking submerged rock after the tightened leash pulled her into the breakwater. Footage from the cable crew helped verify the sequence of events and her earlier disregard of warnings. The town later expanded its current zone markers and updated safety briefings, citing the case as a preventable incident. It was July 4th, 2017, at Lake Lanier, Georgia. A crowded holiday gathering filled a narrow wooden dock with music, coolers, and constant movement between boats, while submerged hazards below the surface went largely unnoticed. Pamela Rhodes was 49 years old and worked in an office support role that required organization, follow-through, and enforcing procedures. Friends described her as assertive and opinionated, especially in group settings where she felt order was being ignored. She often inserted herself into situations without being asked, convinced that problems escalated only because others failed to act quickly enough. Pamela attended the gathering with friends and acquaintances to celebrate the holiday. Alcohol was present throughout the afternoon, and guests moved freely between boats and the dock. The structure was older, built for light foot traffic rather than sustained crowds. Wooden planks showed visible wear, with gaps widening near the edges. Beneath the surface, submerged support beams sat just below varying water depths due to fluctuating lake levels that summer. As the afternoon progressed, congestion increased along the dock. A large cooler filled with ice and drinks had been placed near the edge earlier in the day to serve people stepping off boats. Several guests had already mentioned that it should be moved back toward the center once traffic increased. One man began preparing to relocate it, but was waiting for help to lift it safely, as it was heavy and partially wedged against the planks. Pamela noticed the cooler and became visibly irritated. Witnesses later stated she complained that it was blocking movement and creating a hazard, insisting it should not be there at all. When told it would be moved shortly, she dismissed the explanation and continued gesturing, positioning herself closer to the edge of the dock as she argued. Rather than waiting, Pamela stepped toward the cooler and kicked it sharply, attempting to force it away from the edge. The sudden movement shifted her weight backward. At the same moment, her heel slipped into a widened gap between two planks. With no railing to stop her, she lost balance and fell backward over the side of the dock. Pamela went headfirst into the water, striking a submerged wooden support beam with significant force. The impact fractured her cervical spine. She lost consciousness immediately and sank briefly before resurfacing near the dock. Several guests witnessed the fall and shouted for help. 2 people entered the water, while others tried to locate her position from above. Rescue efforts were delayed by limited visibility and submerged beams obstructing movement. Pamela was pulled from the water several minutes later and laid flat on the dock. Emergency services were called immediately. First responders arrived by boat and shoreline access within approximately 10 minutes. Pamela showed no signs of consciousness and was not breathing effectively. Resuscitation efforts began on scene but were unsuccessful. The medical examiner determined death resulted from blunt force trauma to the neck combined with drowning. The spinal fracture prevented voluntary movement or effective breathing. Toxicology testing showed alcohol present, but not at incapacitating levels. Investigators documented overcrowding beyond the dock's intended capacity and cited the owner for failing to post occupancy warnings. The death was ruled accidental. The gathering ended immediately, and the dock was later modified to restrict future events. It was January 18, 2013, at Alta, Utah, near a ski boundary that had been closed overnight after heavy snowfall. Fresh snow lay deep and quiet. Warning signs were posted, gates were locked, and ski patrol was active along the line. The slope looked calm from below, but the snowpack was unstable and waiting for a trigger. Kara Mullen was 41 and worked as a residential real estate agent in Salt Lake City. She sold mid-range homes and regularly filmed short videos to promote listings and herself. Ski trips were part of that image. She posted often, tracked views and comments, and treated public spaces as places where confidence and persistence usually got results. People who knew her described her as direct, impatient, and unwilling to accept restrictions. Kara skied often, but only within resort systems, using rented gear and relying on patrol to manage hazards. Alta's terrain naturally funnels wind-blown snow into bowls and narrow gullies. After storms, layers of snow can rest on weak surfaces and fail suddenly. Patrol manages this risk with closures and controlled releases, but the system depends on skiers staying out of closed areas. That morning followed a night of heavy snow and strong winds that loaded the slope above the boundary. Patrol closed the gate for avalanche control and posted warnings explaining the risk. Kara arrived with 2 acquaintances, stopped near the rope line, and began filming. She confronted patrol, arguing that her lift ticket gave her access and dismissing the danger despite posted ratings and morning safety notices. Patrol told her a release would be triggered upslope and asked her to move back. Kara continued recording, raised her voice, and pointed her skis downhill. When told again to step away, she ducked under the rope and slid several yards into the closed area, still shouting toward the gate as nearby skiers stopped and watched. Minutes later, patrol followed standard procedures to clear the hazard. The timing was routine for post-storm conditions. Kara was still inside the boundary, moving slowly across the slope with her camera out, ignoring shouted warnings from both above and below, while the snow remained stiff, connected, and ready to break. A crack raced across the slope in a straight line, and a single slab broke free. Dense snow began moving downhill at once. Kara tried to turn, but the slab caught her skis, twisted her legs sideways, and dropped her onto her back. She was carried immediately, rolled as the slide thickened, and pushed toward a narrow gully. She was slammed into a buried rock, crushing her ribs and shoulder, and her helmet split on impact. The moving snow packed around her chest and face, locking her in place. The pressure prevented her lungs from expanding, one arm pinned beneath her body, and within seconds she stopped moving as the debris settled hard around her. Other skiers saw the fracture and contacted patrol immediately. Responders reached the site within minutes, guided by fresh tracks and the last place she had been seen. They cleared her face and airway, but she was not breathing. CPR was started after she was pulled free, but her chest could not rise due to injuries and compression. The medical examiner later reported death from traumatic asphyxia combined with blunt injuries. In simple terms, the packed snow prevented her from breathing, and broken ribs and bruised lungs made survival impossible. Death occurred before rescue efforts could restore breathing. After the incident, patrol installed a solid barricade at that boundary during avalanche control periods. It was March 12, 2018, and the peaceful morning atmosphere of Pediatric Associates Clinic in Denver, Colorado, was disrupted by the sound of shouting and clanking metal as parents arriving for their children's appointments encountered an unexpected obstacle. The medical office, located in a quiet suburban strip mall, typically provided a calm environment for routine checkups and vaccinations, but today's schedule would be interrupted by an act of extremist protest that would turn deadly. Margaret Johnson adjusted the heavy chains wrapped around her waist as she prepared to make what she believed would be a heroic stand against what she called medical tyranny. At 44, the real estate agent had become obsessed with anti-vaccine conspiracy theories after spending countless hours on social media groups that promoted dangerous misinformation about childhood immunizations. Her transformation from successful businesswoman to radical activist had cost her clients, friendships, and family relationships. But Margaret believed she was fighting to save children from what she saw as government-sponsored poisoning. Margaret's descent into anti-vaccine extremism had begun 2 years earlier when her sister's child developed a fever after routine vaccinations, an event that Margaret became convinced was evidence of a massive medical conspiracy. She had immersed herself in online communities that reinforced her fears and provided increasingly radical interpretations of medical research. Her home office was filled with printed articles from discredited websites, homemade signs with alarming slogans, and a megaphone she used during her frequent protests outside medical facilities. The escalation from online activism to real-world confrontation had been gradual, beginning with sharing misinformation on social media and evolving into disrupting medical appointments and harassing healthcare workers. Margaret had been arrested multiple times for trespassing at pediatric offices, but each arrest only reinforced her belief that she was being persecuted for exposing the truth. Her car contained boxes of pamphlets with fabricated medical claims and a collection of chains and padlocks for her planned acts of civil disobedience. That morning, Margaret had arrived at the pediatric clinic with a detailed plan to chain herself to the front entrance during a scheduled vaccination clinic, preventing parents from accessing what she believed were dangerous medical procedures. She had promoted the protest on social media, encouraging other anti-vaccine activists to join her in what she called a mission to protect innocent children from medical harm. Margaret began her protest by wrapping heavy chains around her waist and attempting to secure herself to the glass front door of the medical office. She had practiced the procedure at home, but the actual execution proved more difficult than anticipated, as she struggled with the padlocks while trying to operate her phone to live stream the event for her online followers. As Margaret worked to secure the chains, she began shouting through her megaphone about medical tyranny and the dangers of vaccines, her voice echoing through the strip mall parking lot. Parents arriving with their children for appointments were forced to witness her increasingly erratic behavior, as she claimed to be protecting their kids from poisoning and mind control. When security personnel arrived and attempted to remove Margaret from the property, she became violent and began swinging the heavy chain still attached to her waist. The 6-foot length of metal chain became a dangerous weapon, as Margaret flailed wildly, trying to prevent anyone from approaching her or interfering with her protest. In her frenzied movements, Margaret lost control of the heavy chain and struck herself in the head with tremendous force. The metal links connected with her temple, causing severe head trauma and a fractured skull. The impact was so forceful that Margaret immediately lost consciousness and collapsed to the ground, still chained to the doorframe. Margaret Johnson died from massive brain injury caused by her own chain, bleeding internally as her anti-vaccine pamphlets scattered around her body in the morning breeze. Her live stream continued recording as she died, broadcasting her final moments to the online community that had encouraged her extremist behavior. The pediatric office was forced to close for the day, causing dozens of children to miss important vaccinations. Investigation revealed that Margaret had been planning increasingly dangerous protests, including attempts to disrupt hospital emergency rooms and medical conferences. Strangely, Margaret's phone contained a draft social media post scheduled for later that day that read, "If something happens to me, know that I died fighting for the truth," a message that suggested she may have anticipated the dangerous outcome of her protest, raising questions about whether her death was accidental or a form of martyrdom for her cause. It was April 27, 2018. The residential district of Chamberí in Madrid, Spain, sat under a hazy afternoon sun. Rosa Delgado, a 34-year-old part-time reseller who had built a side income flipping goods online, was about to make a decision that would end her life in one of the most preventable ways imaginable. Rosa had earned a reputation among local delivery workers as confrontational and aggressive. Over the previous 18 months, she'd been accused by 3 separate courier services of intercepting packages meant for neighbors in her apartment complex. She denied everything, often screaming at drivers who questioned her, threatening to file complaints about their service. Online reselling had become Rosa's primary income after losing her retail job 2 years prior, and neighbors noticed increasing desperation in her behavior. Witness accounts said that she would loiter near building entrances during peak delivery hours, sometimes following couriers up stairwells. Property management had received multiple complaints, but without concrete proof, no action was taken against her lease. Package theft in urban Spanish apartment buildings had become increasingly common by 2018, and a handful of fringe delivery startups had begun quietly testing unauthorized drone drop-offs onto balconies and rooftops, despite such flights being prohibited over populated areas by Spanish aviation authorities. The practice remained rare, controversial, and highly visible when it occurred. Balconies in older Madrid buildings, particularly those constructed in the 1970s, featured decorative iron railings attached with mounting brackets that corroded over decades of exposure to rain and temperature fluctuations. These railings were never designed to bear significant weight or withstand climbing stress, serving purely aesthetic and light safety purposes. That afternoon, Rosa spotted a delivery drone placing a package on a 4th-floor balcony 3 units over from her 3rd-floor apartment. The building's CCTV system captured her emerging onto her own balcony at 3:42 in the afternoon, eyeing the package. The item sat clearly visible, a medium-sized box marked with a premium electronics retailer's logo. Rather than attempting to access it through legitimate means or simply ignoring it, Rosa made the catastrophic decision to climb between balconies. The horizontal distance was roughly 4 feet, with a 40-foot drop to the concrete courtyard below. Building surveillance showed Rosa stepping onto her balcony railing, testing her weight briefly before committing. She reached for the neighboring balcony's decorative ironwork, gripping the vertical bars with both hands. For approximately 3 seconds, she hung suspended between balconies, her feet searching for purchase on the adjoining ledge. The corroded embedded anchors securing the railing to the masonry had been weakening for years, hidden behind decorative plasterwork that concealed the rust eating through the metal anchors. The decorative ironwork was not rated to support lateral or bridging loads. The bracket failed completely, the entire decorative railing section separated from the wall with Rosa still gripping it. A courtyard-facing security camera mounted on the opposite facade captured her sudden disappearance from frame, showing only a grainy silhouette and a visible timestamp as she fell 4 stories, the heavy ironwork falling with her. A neighbor hanging laundry on the ground floor heard the impact and immediately called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, finding Rosa unresponsive in the courtyard with the twisted railing beside her. The medical examiner's report stated she suffered multiple blunt force injuries, including severe spinal fractures, traumatic brain injury from skull impact, massive internal bleeding from ruptured liver and spleen, and crushed ribs that punctured both lungs. The injuries were immediately unsurvivable and consistent with death on impact. The CCTV footage became key evidence in the subsequent investigation. Authorities closed the case as accidental death resulting from criminal trespass attempt, with no criminal charges laid against the deceased. Building management inspected all exterior railings, finding 12 additional units with dangerously corroded mounts. It was October 9th, 2016 in Manila, Philippines, on a warm, humid evening as hotel guests stepped onto their balconies to watch the sunset over the bay. The sky was clear, the water reflected orange light, and the upper floors were filled with people taking photos of the skyline. On the 27th floor was 29-year-old Lorna Del Monte, an office worker from Quezon City, on a weekend trip with two friends. Lorna was known among people who traveled with her for pushing limits during photos, climbing railings, leaning too far, and arguing with anyone who suggested she stop. She had already been pacing in and out of the balcony, complaining loudly that the railing was ruining her angles. The balcony had standard safety features: a waist-high railing, smooth floor tiles, and a lightweight patio chair. None of it was meant for climbing, but Lorna dragged the chair toward the edge anyway. Her friends told her several times to step down, but she brushed them off, telling them to quit exaggerating. Guests on the next balcony noticed her behavior. One woman leaned over and said in a calm voice that standing on the chair wasn't safe on a high floor. Lorna immediately snapped back, raising her voice so half the floor could hear. She insisted she had every right to take photos however she wanted, adding that she paid for this balcony and could use it any way she sees fit. The visitor tried again to warn her about the wobbling chair, but Lorna cut her off, telling her to mind her own business. Her friends tried to intervene, but Lorna waved them away, saying they were ruining her shot. She climbed onto the patio chair, holding her phone outward, repeating that people needed to stop policing everything. More guests stepped onto their balconies to capture the sunset. Several noticed Lorna shifting her stance on the chair, trying to tilt her phone farther out over the rail. A guest 2 floors above later reported seeing the chair legs slide slightly, each time she leaned forward. At 5:56 p.m., the light was at its brightest, a deep orange. Lorna leaned farther over the balcony, telling her friends she needed one more photo. Witnesses on the balcony said she pushed her whole upper body past the railing, while stretching her arm outward with her phone. As she shifted her weight, the back leg of the chair slid on the smooth tile. Just an inch, her friend later said, but enough to throw off her footing. Since her upper body was already extended beyond the railing, that tiny slide pulled her center of gravity forward. The chair tipped, and her upper body went over with it. Guests on the 26th and 25th floors later reported hearing a sharp, heavy impact on the utility roof below. Several people on the pool deck looked up after hearing the same sound and notified hotel staff. From inside the room, one friend immediately called for help, while the other kept repeating that she had told Lorna to get off the chair. A guest in the neighboring room contacted emergency services after hearing the thud and seeing movement on the lower roof. Hotel security reached the utility roof within minutes and cleared the surrounding area. Lorna's friends were escorted indoors while responders conducted an on-scene assessment and secured the location for emergency crews. Investigators concluded that Lorna died from multiple blunt force injuries consistent with a high-rise fall, noting the unstable chair, her position beyond the railing, and her refusal to step down as contributing factors. Staff later recovered her phone, which contained a partially framed bay photo taken seconds before the fall. Maintenance removed patio chairs from all upper-level balconies, and management added more prominent safety notices. It was March 19, 2016, in Mesa, Arizona. A busy grocery store prepared for a weekend surge as restocking crews worked alongside customers in tight aisles. Pallet jacks moved steadily, carts queued, and small conflicts surfaced in confined spaces. The environment appeared routine, yet the overlap of machinery and foot traffic created immediate physical risk. Sandra Holt was 54 years old and worked in a clerical records role for a regional office. Her position required accuracy, compliance, and strict adherence to procedure. Co-workers described her as methodical, rigid, and quick to correct mistakes she observed in others. She believed rules existed to prevent disorder and felt obligated to enforce them. Outside work, Sandra applied the same mindset to public settings. She regularly confronted strangers over line etiquette, spacing, and store policies. She had previously argued with grocery staff about checkout procedures and stocking practices. That morning, she entered the store during a peak restock window when inventory carts filled the aisles. The store layout featured narrow aisles lined with steel shelving anchored to the concrete floor. Restocking crews used manual pallet jacks carrying loads exceeding 2,000 pounds. Store policy instructed customers to yield during active stocking, but enforcement relied on cooperation rather than barriers. As Sandra moved through a central aisle, she encountered an employee pulling a loaded pallet jack forward. She stepped directly behind the pallet jack while it was being maneuvered and began gesturing, intentionally blocking its movement. Witnesses later stated she refused to step aside, insisting she had the right to stop the operation because customers were entitled to unrestricted aisle access. Another employee approached from the opposite direction to help guide the moving pallet through the narrow clearance, signaling that the equipment was actively in motion. The combined activity increased pressure in the confined space. The floor sloped slightly toward a refrigeration unit. The pallet jack shifted. The loaded platform rolled backward as weight transferred unevenly. Sandra remained positioned behind it. There was no warning horn or automatic brake. The metal frame struck her lower body and pinned her against a steel shelving upright. The force crushed her pelvis and compressed her torso. Shelving flexed but did not detach. Sandra collapsed as internal bleeding began and became unresponsive shortly afterward. Bystanders rushed forward. Several attempted to pull the pallet jack away while another employee called emergency services. The equipment was moved enough to free her, but she remained unresponsive. Paramedics arrived within several minutes. They found Sandra without a detectable pulse and with severe traumatic injuries. Resuscitation efforts began on scene but were unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead before transport. The medical examiner determined death resulted from massive internal hemorrhage caused by pelvic fractures and thoracic compression. Injuries were consistent with crush force from industrial equipment. Toxicology testing showed no intoxicants. Investigators reviewed store surveillance footage, which confirmed the sequence of events and showed no reckless operation by employees. The pallet jack functioned normally, and the load was within limits. The primary factor cited was deliberate pedestrian interference with active industrial equipment. The death was ruled accidental. No charges were filed. The store modified restocking procedures, adding temporary aisle closures during heavy pallet movement. The case was closed after administrative review. Authorities concluded the incident was preventable through better separation of customers and equipment, and no fault was assigned to employees involved. It was January 15, 2015, and the post-holiday shopping atmosphere at a large department store in Tampa, Florida, buzzed with customers returning unwanted gifts and taking advantage of clearance sales. The 120,000 square foot store's customer service department had been overwhelmed since New Year's Day with returns, exchanges, and complaints from shoppers dealing with holiday purchases. Susan Rodriguez wheeled a shopping cart overflowing with designer clothing, shoes, and accessories toward the customer service counter, her eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who had perfected an elaborate scam. At 41, the administrative assistant had transformed retail returns into a lucrative side business, using fraudulent receipts and stolen credit cards to return obviously used merchandise for full refunds. Her spare bedroom had been converted into a warehouse of stolen goods. Susan's return fraud operation had generated over $30,000 in illegal profits over the past 2 years, funded by an elaborate network of fake identities, stolen credit cards, and forged receipts. She maintained detailed spreadsheets tracking her fraudulent activities across dozens of retailers, rotating between stores to avoid detection while building relationships with naive employees. The evolution from occasional fraudulent return to full-scale criminal enterprise had been gradual, beginning with legitimate returns that Susan realized could be manipulated for profit. She had studied store policies and developed increasingly sophisticated methods for creating fake documentation. That afternoon, Susan had arrived with her most ambitious scam yet, a cart full of obviously worn designer clothing that she planned to return using fake receipts. The merchandise showed clear signs of use, including makeup stains, stretched fabric, and missing tags. Susan approached the customer service counter, presenting a stack of obviously fraudulent receipts for merchandise that had clearly been worn extensively. When the customer service manager examined the merchandise and noticed the clear evidence of use, Susan became increasingly aggressive. She claimed the store was discriminating against her and threatened to file complaints with corporate headquarters. The manager politely explained that the store could not accept returns for obviously used merchandise without proper documentation. Susan's response was to become violent, throwing hangers and clothing items at the employees while screaming about customer service and corporate theft. Determined to take what she considered rightfully hers, Susan climbed over the customer service counter to access the cash register directly. Her face was flushed red with rage, and her breathing had become rapid and labored from the physical exertion and extreme stress of the confrontation. Years of poor diet, smoking, and untreated hypertension had taken their toll on her cardiovascular system. As Susan reached for the cash register, while screaming at the employees, the combination of extreme rage, physical exertion, and her pre-existing heart condition triggered a massive heart attack. She clutched her chest and collapsed behind the customer service counter, her face turning blue as her heart stopped beating. Despite immediate CPR attempts by store employees and paramedics who arrived within minutes, Susan Rodriguez died from cardiac arrest on the customer service floor, surrounded by the fraudulent merchandise she had tried to return. The stress and fury of her failed scam had literally caused her heart to give out. Investigation revealed an extensive criminal network involving stolen identities and return scams, totaling over $75,000. Curiously, Susan's purse contained a lottery ticket for that evening's drawing worth $50 million, a ticket she would never get to check, leaving people to wonder if her life of crime might have ended differently if she had just waited one more day. It was August 9, 2016, at a coastal zoo in Monterey, California, on a busy summer afternoon when the walrus exhibit stayed packed with visitors leaning along the rail, holding up phones as the animal surfaced and sank in slow cycles, while posted rules about distance and barriers were visible every few yards, but routinely ignored. Laura Whitcomb was 42 and worked as a regional sales coordinator, a job that kept her traveling and constantly documenting trips and outings. People who knew her described her as forceful and argumentative, especially in public places, where she often challenged staff and treated posted rules as negotiable rather than fixed. She was visiting the zoo with a coworker and focused on getting a close selfie with the walrus, not a zoomed photo and not one taken from behind the barrier. She followed travel pages that praised risky behavior and had no experience with large animals, yet regularly dismissed safety rules as exaggerated or designed mainly to reduce liability. The walrus enclosure used a low, inward-sloped concrete barrier that separated visitors from a deep saltwater pool. Multiple signs warned against leaning, climbing, or reaching over the edge, and staff presence was higher during feeding windows because the animals were more active. A keeper had just finished reminding people to step back when Laura stopped and began arguing. She accused staff of overreacting, pointed to other visitors near the rail, and claimed the walrus was trained and harmless. She raised her phone and started recording, saying the rules were only for appearance, and when the warning was repeated, she climbed onto the barrier ledge to frame herself with the animal in the background. The concrete surface was wet from splashback. Laura leaned forward, holding her phone down toward the water, as the walrus surfaced nearby, while waving her free hand to get its attention. Her weight shifted past the balance point of the barrier. Staff shouted for her to move back, and several people stepped away. The walrus surged upward suddenly, forcing water over the edge. Witnesses saw its body rise and felt the splash as a flipper struck Laura's forearm, knocking her off balance. Her phone flew out of her hand, her upper body tipped forward, and she went over the barrier headfirst into the pool. The animal reacted immediately to the unexpected entry. In the churned water, it made contact again, gripping her upper arm and shoulder with its mouth and pulling her several feet away from the edge as it submerged. Laura surfaced briefly, gasping, but was dragged under again as the walrus rolled. Water entered her airway while her legs kicked unevenly and then slowed. Underwater, her head struck the sloped concrete wall, and bubbles rose in a short burst before thinning. The walrus released her and moved toward deeper water, as alarms sounded throughout the exhibit. Emergency services were called right away. Staff used poles and flotation devices, but could not enter the pool until the animal cleared the area, which took nearly 2 minutes. When Laura was pulled out, she was unresponsive, with pale blue skin and water draining from her mouth and nose. CPR began on the deck within moments. Paramedics arrived 8 minutes after the call and continued resuscitation while transporting her, but she never regained a pulse. The medical examiner listed drowning as the primary cause of death, with blunt force injuries to the head and shoulder from striking the enclosure wall as contributing factors, meaning she inhaled water after being pulled under and injured during the struggle. Security footage confirmed the argument. The climb, the fall, and the delay caused by the animal's movement, and the zoo later raised the barrier height and added fixed standoff rails. It was January 22, 2017. A popular downtown Toronto coffee shop buzzed with Sunday afternoon traffic, voices overlapping beneath the hiss of the espresso machine. Nina Tremblay sat across from Samir Hassan at a small corner table, arms folded, coffee untouched, mid-complaint, another routine confrontation in a life shaped by friction, unaware it would be the last one she ever made. Nina had graduated 4 years earlier with a marketing degree from a mid-tier Ontario college, but chronic workplace conflicts had left her cycling through temp jobs and retail positions. Friends described her as intelligent but combative. She'd been fired 3 times in 2 years, always insisting she was standing up for herself against disrespect. Samir, a junior accountant she'd matched with on a dating app, knew none of this background when he suggested meeting at the coffee shop near his condo. The date had started awkwardly. Nina complained about the lighting, the music volume, and the chair wobbling. 15 minutes in, she marched to the counter, demanding a refund because the drink was supposedly lukewarm. The barista politely offered to remake it, explaining the thermometer showed all drinks left the machine at proper temperature. Nina's voice rose. She insisted the temperature was unacceptable and demanded her money back immediately. The shift supervisor, trained in de-escalation, calmly refused the refund, but again offered a fresh drink at no charge. Nina's face flushed red. She grabbed a freshly prepared drink waiting on the pickup counter, a scalding beverage just pulled from the espresso machine, and deliberately dumped the entire contents across the polished marble floor while shouting about customer service. Other patrons backed away as the steaming liquid spread rapidly across the reflective surface. The supervisor immediately reached for the phone to call 911, while another employee moved toward the counter area. Nina continued her tirade. She gestured wildly, her attention focused entirely on the staff behind the counter. Still yelling, she took 3 aggressive steps backward toward her table where Samir sat frozen with embarrassment. Her left boot slid forward as it hit the expanding pool of coffee. The liquid had reduced surface friction to nearly nothing on the polished marble. Nina's legs shot forward as her center of mass pitched backward. She fell with full body weight, her trajectory carrying her backward at an angle. The base of her skull struck the exposed stainless steel corner of a refrigerated display case with devastating force. Witnesses later described a sharp, sickening crack that echoed across the shop. Nina's body went instantly limp, her eyes open but unseeing. Blood pooled rapidly beneath her head, spreading across the floor. A customer with nursing experience checked for breathing and found none, immediately calling emergency services. When paramedics arrived at the coffee shop, Nina had no pulse and was not breathing, and attempts to revive her were unsuccessful. A later examination by the coroner confirmed she had suffered a severe fracture at the base of her skull, which caused critical damage to the part of the brain responsible for breathing and heart function, making it clear that the injury shut down her body almost immediately and left no chance of survival. Investigators reviewed statements from multiple witnesses and determined the death was accidental, resulting directly from Nina's own reckless behavior. No charges were filed against the coffee shop or staff. Samir provided a written statement describing Nina's escalating aggression throughout their brief date, which corroborated the evidence. The criminal investigation concluded within 2 weeks, with the coroner's formal report issued afterward, closing the case without further action. It was August 4th, 2017 in Eugene, Oregon. A Friday night when the downtown multiplex was packed for the late showing of a new superhero movie. The air smelled of popcorn and soda, and ushers moved between theaters cleaning up from earlier showings. Inside Auditorium 6, where the 10:30 p.m. screening was just beginning, 48-year-old Linda Sinclair had already taken a seat in the middle row, sipping from a large drink and scrolling through her phone. Linda worked as a retail supervisor at a clothing outlet nearby and was known to co-workers as outspoken and sometimes argumentative. According to friends, she often came to late movies alone after having drinks at a bar down the street that night. She had purchased a general admission ticket, but sat in a seat marked as reserved, part of the theater's new numbered seating system that had caused confusion and frequent disputes since being introduced a few months earlier. At 10:37 p.m., a couple entered and walked toward the center of the row where Linda was seated. Their tickets showed the same seat number she occupied, and they asked her to move. Witnesses said she refused, insisting she had arrived first. The couple went to get assistance, and 2 ushers returned a few minutes later, checking tickets under the dim theater lighting. When they asked her to move to her assigned seat, she declined. Security footage showed Linda standing, holding her phone, and arguing with staff while waiting for a manager. When he approached, she began recording, and nearby patrons started watching as the dispute grew louder. As the ushers stood their ground, Linda began stepping backward, trying to keep all 3 employees in her camera frame. The stadium-style seating had narrow, steep steps between each row, with just enough width for a single foot. Witnesses seated 2 rows below later said she moved without looking behind her. When her heel landed partly off the step, her weight shifted suddenly. Her left ankle twisted and she lost balance. In one motion, her body tipped backward into the aisle. The fall covered about 5 feet in elevation, enough to generate a strong impact. Her head struck the steel base of the aisle handrail before her phone slid down several steps, its flashlight still on. The theater went silent for several seconds before a man near the aisle called out for help. Staff immediately stopped the film and turned on the overhead lights. The ushers moved the crowd back while one checked for a pulse. A nurse who happened to be in the audience assisted until paramedics arrived roughly 7 minutes later. Linda was unresponsive and was later pronounced dead at the hospital from blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Police reviewed the footage from both the theater cameras and audience phones. The investigation determined the fall was accidental and that staff had acted appropriately. Toxicology tests found moderate alcohol levels in her system, but no drugs. The medical examiner confirmed a fatal skull fracture consistent with impact against a fixed metal surface. The theater reopened the next day, but implemented new safety and seating protocols. Ushers were instructed to verify reserved seating before each showing to prevent disputes, and small warning signs were added to stairway entries reminding patrons to watch their step staff. Later said it was the first and only fatal accident the location had ever experienced, an argument that turned tragic within seconds. It was July 18, 2015, at a county fairgrounds in central Iowa. The afternoon was warm and sticky, food stands were crowded, and people moved between games, booths, and small attractions. Near the center of the fair, volunteers set up a simple stage for a corn dog eating contest sponsored by a local diner. It was meant to be slow, friendly, and easy. One of the participants was 45-year-old Karen Halford, a part-time receptionist known in her neighborhood for arguing with staff at nearly every community event. Volunteers recognized her immediately. She had caused problems at raffles, parking areas, and even kids' craft tables. Karen often treated rules as optional and insisted she deserved exceptions whenever she showed up. At registration, the organizer, Tom, explained the simple rules. Small bites, normal pace, water as needed. It wasn't timed. It wasn't a race. Witnesses said Karen cut him off almost immediately, talking over him and saying she didn't need instructions. Several people in line stepped aside as she kept arguing, insisting she would do it her own way. When Tom handed her the waiver, Karen objected again. A volunteer later said she argued for a couple of minutes, calling the form pointless, before finally signing with quick, forceful strokes. At the table, a front-row spectator saw her drag her tray closer, despite instructions to keep everything aligned for the cable recording. When Tom reminded her, she snapped that he was targeting her and refused to move it back. At 2:03 p.m., the contest began. Most people took small bites, laughed, and talked casually. Karen did the opposite. She grabbed each corn dog near the base and took large, fast bites, barely chewing. Several spectators later said it looked like she was trying to beat everyone, even though no one else was treating it like a competition. About 2 minutes in, she reached for her third corn dog. She bit off a large piece and tilted her head back to swallow it quickly. A nearby volunteer started to remind her to slow down, but Karen waved him off without breaking rhythm. Seconds later, she began coughing. Witnesses described it as short, sharp coughs at first, more like she was trying to push the food down. Then, according to security footage reviewed later, her upper body went rigid, and her arms pulled in close to her chest. The coughing stopped altogether. She reached for her water cup but dropped it before she could drink. Spectators saw Karen stagger sideways, knocking over her tray and spilling water across the platform. 2 people with basic first aid training stepped forward. One attempted abdominal thrusts while the other tried to check if anything was visible in her mouth, but nothing changed. The obstruction did not move. EMTs arrived within minutes. Ushers moved benches to clear a path as responders came through. From the edge of the crowd, people could see EMTs continuing airway checks and performing additional thrusts, but no visible response followed. The stage was closed off, and fair staff blocked the area with temporary fencing. Food-related events were canceled for the rest of the day. Later that evening, officials confirmed that Karen Halford died from a complete airway blockage caused by a large, unchewed piece of food. Security footage showed her ignoring the safety instructions, rushing through the contest, and refusing reminders to slow down. Fair organizers removed all eating competitions from future schedules and added updated guidelines stressing slow, careful consumption at public food activities.